This will be a update on rules as relates to drones. Um, it will be a little bit agriculture specific because we're going to talk about a couple of interpretations of rules and how that affects agriculture from that standpoint. So, can you fly a drone today? So, from that standpoint, you need to consider, are you flying the drone for a recreational or just for a hobby purpose? Or are you flying it as part of a business? And in a lot of instances, if you're making a management decision, that is definitely considered a business. The other aspect that sometimes comes up is, are you going to write the drone off as part of your enterprise? And if you are, then it's definitely part of your business. So why do we have rules to begin with? And this chart here sort of says it as if we're putting an aircraft in the air, then the FAA or Federal Aviation Administration is concerned about it in different ways, and the FAA divides the airspace that we have above us into different classes. Those classes are a lot depend upon airports and the size of the airport, and then majority of the airspace that we would be flying in is called Class G airspace, or 1,200 to 700 feet above ground level is most of the area that we're going to be flying a drone in. So, if you are flying a drone and only flying it for recreational purposes, you have to maintain an above ground level of 400 feet or below. Remain clear of surrounding obstacles. One of the things that's it's not completely in the recreational rules, but one of the things that the FAA will definitely bring up, and it is part of the rules in a business use, is keeping visual line of sight. I think that's just a safety consideration. And you do not want to interfere with any manned aircraft. That's part of the reason that 400 feet is in that. So usually an aircraft is most commonly above that, except for when they're landing or taking off at around an airport. So again, this is recreational purposes. Do not fly within 5 miles of an airport unless you're in contact with them. Notice that this says airport. It doesn't say what kind of airport. We won't be mentioning in recreational rules anything about airspace, the classes of airspace. So keep that in mind. Do not fly near people or stadiums. One of my biggest pet peeves is seeing a drone above a crowd. That is a safety no-no. We're not supposed to fly over people. Do not fly an aircraft that weighs more than 55 pounds. Most everything that's commercially available today to fly is well below that 55-pound limit. And you don't want to be careless or reckless, or you could potentially be fined depending on the severity of what that might be. So I keep this slide in the rules because it was an interpretation made back in June of 2014 related to agriculture, and they had a chart that came out here, and it mentions in the last one that I got the red box around an agricultural application. If you're just flying to see things, there's lots of YouTube videos out there of agriculture, of just flying to capture self-planting, harvesting, whatever. That is a recreational use, unless you're marketing your farm for further business. But if you're making a decision, such as what we discussed in a previous presentation about nitrogen, then that is considered part of the operation, and it's a business use, and it's not recreational. So we'll see how the changes in the rules would affect that. So in August of 2019, or August 29th of 2016, is when Part 107 is referred to, or the Small Unmanned Aircraft Rule went into effect. It was actually publicly known on the 21st of June, and then it went into effect on August 29th. So what does that say? Unmanned aircraft must weigh less than 55 pounds. We just seen that that's the same as a recreational rule. It does specifically state in Part 107 that visual line of sight is required. The unmanned aircraft must remain within visual line of sight of the remote pilot in command and the person manipulating the flight controls. And we'll talk more about remote pilot in command here. Alternatively, the unmanned aircraft must remain within visual line of sight of a visual observer. So you can use more than just a pilot to keep that visual line of sight, but it's with your own eyesight. Nothing, you can't use binoculars or any other kind of aid beyond just eyeglasses. Small aircraft may not operate over persons not directly participating in the operation, not under a covered structure, and not inside a covered stationary vehicle. Can only operate within daylight hours, and that's 30 minutes before sunrise to 30 minutes after sunset. And you have to have lighting if you're within those. You must yield right away to other aircraft, and we just talked about visual observers. You may use a visual observer, but it's not required. So, first-person view camera cannot satisfy, see, and avoid. So if you've watched drone racing on ESPN, they're using first-person view cameras to fly the drones when they're racing them. You can't not do that from a business standpoint. Maximum ground speed of 100 miles per hour. Most all the drones that we'll use commercially get you in that 30 to 40 miles per hour range. Maximum altitude of 400 feet above ground level. We've seen that in the recreational rules. Only change in that from a Part 107 standpoint is if higher than that. So if you're going to fly, if you're inspecting a structure that is over 400 feet, you have the right to fly 400 feet within that structure. So you have an envelope around that structure of 400 feet. So if the tower was 400 feet, you could fly 400 feet above that with stipulations of where you're at in the airspace. You need to consider weather to some extent. Weather visibility of 3 miles from ground control. Now we're going to get into, there's no more 5 miles away from the airport. Now it's related to what class of airspace you're in. Operations in class B, C, D, or E are allowed, but you're going to have required permission from air traffic control. And there's a process that you go through that's not detailed in this presentation, a waiver process to get that permission if you had to do that. If you're in Class G airspace, you do not have to have control. So there are a few, I would call municipal airports that are not towered airports that would be in Class G airspace. You do not specifically have to have permission to fly in that airspace from that. So it's one of those things that you need to know where you're at and what kind of airspace you're in around this. So Benzis is around Missouri. Class B airspace would be around St. Louis and Kansas City Airport. Here in Columbia, near the University of Missouri, south of Columbia, to Columbia Regional Airport. That airport has Class D airspace around it. So Bradford Research Center, there's a part of it, of the farm, the Bay Farm, which adjoins the Bradford Farm, that is in Class D airspace. We can fly there. We just have to have a waiver to be able to fly in that airspace. So some other things: no person may act as a remote pilot in command for more than one aircraft at a time. You cannot operate from a moving aircraft. No operations from a moving vehicle unless operations in a sparsely populated area. You can't be careless or reckless. You can't carry any hazardous materials with your drone. Some other things: you're supposed to sort of keep some basic records from a flying standpoint, such as pre-flight inspections. A person may not operate the aircraft if he knows or has a reason of any physical or mental condition that would interfere with the operation. External load operations are allowed if the objects are being carried securely, and that would relate to our case in agriculture. If you're using some camera or sensor technology, that just means it has to be on the drone securely, and it's not going to adversely affect the flight characteristics of the drone itself. So we've mentioned this remote pilot in command. That's one thing Part 107 established, was this remote pilot in command position, and that is a person operating a small UAS or unmanned aircraft system. They must hold a remote pilot airman certificate with a small UAS rating, or be under the direct supervision of a person who does hold a remote pilot certificate. So you can have somebody else with you that is doing the flying, and you're the remote pilot, is what that's saying. Or you can be flying and not have a remote pilot certificate, as long as somebody there is that remote pilot in command. So how do you become a remote pilot? How do you get that certification? You need to take a test. You demonstrate your aeronautical knowledge by either passing this initial aeronautic knowledge test at an FAA approved knowledge testing center, or if you already have a pilot certificate or pilot license, you just need to do an online test to be approved to get the classification to be a remote pilot also. As part of the process, after you pass that test, this vetted by the TSA is part of the process as you finalize your licensing, and you have to be at least 16 years old to do this. So that initial test, that initial knowledge test, is 60 questions. You have 2 hours to take those 60 questions. It costs you $150 to take the test to be certified. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the types of things that you would see on the test. One is some aviation weather information. That was a little difficult for me, but you got to understand, like figure 12 here, it's asking you what the wind direction and velocity at KFJK is, and you can sort of pick out what line of information that is. Then you can sort of see that it's probably 180 degrees there, but is it magnetic or true at 4 knots? And it's true. That's the answer to that question. Here's an airspace. So this is very understanding. So Savannah, Georgia. There's Class C airspace. How do I know it's Class C airspace? It's this magenta, solid magenta line around the airport. And it's asking what is the floor of the Savannah Class C airspace at the shelf area, the outer circle. So if you look here at this outer circle, it's got 41 and 13. So it's 1,300 feet, but is it above ground level or is it at mean sea level? So around Class C airspace, that elevation is mean sea level. 1,300 feet is the bottom of the shelf around that airspace. This center circle, it says SFC. That goes to the surface up to 4,100 feet. It's like an upside down wedding cake. So you have to know those kind of things. Some other things you have to know as part of the rules that upon request from the FAA, your aircraft may be asked to be inspected or tested. You're going to have maybe documents or records kept of your flight times and what you've been doing. If you have an accident, report within 10 days that results in at least a serious injury, loss of consciousness, or property damage of at least $500. So this would be a test question, or could be. Depends on what 60 questions you get in the database. Conduct a pre-flight inspection. We just talked about that to include the specific aircraft and control station to make sure everything's into control. That's pretty self-explanatory. You need to ensure that your aircraft complies with the existing registration requirements, and we'll talk about that. And it's sort of interesting, this last statement, if you do have an emergency, you can deviate from any of the requirements of the rules. So if you needed to go beyond line of sight or go above 400 feet, you can do that in case of an emergency. It's also interesting that the FAA airworthiness certificate is not required for the UAS or the drone. However, the remote pilot, again, stipulates pre-flight check of the aircraft to make sure it is in condition for safe operation. Now, registration. This goes clear back to December 21st of 2015. FAA opened up this drone registration process that any drone above 0.55 pounds needed to be registered. Now, that process required you to pay $5 to register aircraft. Doesn't matter if you're a hobbyist or business at that point in time. Then there was some legislation that passed that said we didn't have to do that. Now this is still in effect today. So if you have a drone, you should be registered. Now that there basically just register yourself. So anything between 0.55 pounds and 55 pounds should be registered if you're operating it outdoors. And that's what this registration looks like. And you're just registering yourself basically, and I can have 100 drones underneath this registration. So you just have this and you've got a number that's associated with that. Now for business use, every drone that you use has to be registered by itself. They say that they don't require a serial number, but it's very good to have that number, and then each drone has its own number. You notice it expires here in 2019, so it'll have to be re-registered. So that's $5 a drone that's out there. And then finally, what we'll talk about is, so your remote pilot in command lasts for 2 years. So every 2 years you have to be recertified. So that recurrent training and testing requirement is every 24 calendar months. And you have to retake a recurrent It's a different test. They'll call it knowledge test, but it's called a recurrency test. It is only 40 questions, and you have 90 minutes to take it instead of the 60 and 120. The couple of things that test does not have on it is any weather-related questions that I showed you, and I didn't show you any questions related to loading of the drone itself or the aircraft itself. Those are not. The majority of the test is on the rules that we've talked about and airspace, such as the airspace question I showed you in reading sectional charts. That is a majority of the test that's out there, and you need to at least get a 70% on the test. And I just happened to take it here just a little over a month ago to maintain my remote pilot certification. So that sort of goes through the rules that's there. A very easy site to go through to familiarize yourself with everything that we've talked about in the presentation is knowbeforeyoufly.org, and that's a real nice website to tell you things about what we need to do. So with that provides you a little bit of an update on rules, where we're at, and if you have any questions, you've got my contact information here.